So, like, what was some of the exciting research that was going on with your contemporaries as you were, at Dartmouth, working against the clock, now suddenly realizing there are other people catching on to this discovery? What were other people doing at the time that you were excited about?
Well, the field then picked up pretty rapidly after 1980, and because it was clear that the T cell growth factor, which became interleukin 2, was probably not the only molecule that was out there. And so there were a lot of people that were interested in the whole process about how B cells made antibodies or were directed to make antibodies, and there must have been molecules involved very similar to interleukin 2 that were involved in that. And so there were groups of investigators that sort of arose out of the murky, swampy land.
The immunological soup.
Yeah, the immunological soup. And the interesting thing was that a lot of them were in Japan.
Why was that?
Well, the Americans were sort of the creme de la creme in the science, and I think all sciences at that time. They were the knowledgeable, the knowledge makers, and so forth and so on. And as I said earlier, they were focused on the activation via the antigen. They didn't want to deal with this stuff. They called, instead of lymphokines, which was the word or cytokines, which is the word that became used to describe these whole family, which became a whole family of molecules, and now there's 43 of them. Instead of calling them lymphokines or cytokines, they called them lymphodrek.
Lymphodrek.
Yeah, or catsup for Con-A activated T cell soup.
Wow.
It's a derogatory. It's just and because they hadn't really been defined molecularly and so forth. It was all phenomenology, and they didn't really want to deal
stuff
with
they couldn't quantify or put a nail on, so they didn't want to bother.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but the Japanese who were coming up in the world, several groups over there who got into it in big time, were major players in the field. But at the same time, there were people in Europe and also in the States that jumped on board as well. So by the end of the 80s, by the 90s, the field was really maturing fast at that stage of the game. And they were looking for, they weren't necessarily competing directly with me in the interleukin 2 story, but they were looking for their own interleukin. So we got interleukin 3, 4, 5, 6, and it kept on going.
Right.
And then the receptors had to be discovered and characterized at the molecular level. All these different kinds of things were going on. And so you go to the meetings and more people were jumping on board. So it was quite exhilarating, essentially.
Was it exciting to see other people making discoveries like that?
Oh yeah, no, and well, then they sorted out as to friends and foes. Like I think it's like a schoolyard.
Right. The cliques started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had your friends, and then you had your enemies. And
yeah.
Or frenemies, and
friendly rivalries.
Right.
Yeah. Were there any big friendly rivalries that sort of stand out to you from the time, like with competing labs that were duking it out over various things?
Well, there was one major one from Japan that I lost races to, and then there was another one. There's another story that I'll tell in a second. But the one major one was a fellow by the name of Tada Taniguchi. He was from Osaka originally, and he happened to be. He wasn't an immunologist at all. He had been involved in interferon work.
Okay.
Interferon is a similar kind of a molecule that is made by the immune system cells that interferes with viruses, viral replication. That's how it's got its name. And so he had done a postdoc in Switzerland, and he had identified the DNA clone for interferon And then he'd gone back to Japan and set up his own lab. And he was approached by people asking him to see if he could clone interleukin 2. So he did. And he beat us by about 2 months, and because we were trying to do exactly the same thing. And that was a major loss for us, because we, up until that time, and that was in 83, 84, around in there, we'd basically done everything in the field.
You had a clean run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was when the going got tough. And John Mitchell from Nixon's administration said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Yeah.
So we got going. And that was the major one. There was another Japanese guy that was a friend, he's a buddy, and his name was Kazuo Sugimura, and he was in Sendai. But this was back in the 80s and late 80s and 90s, and I haven't gotten into the whole molecular characterization of the interleukin 2 receptor, but it turns out there's 3 different chains, protein chains, that comprise the receptor. We discovered evidence for the very first one in 1982, and then in 87, the second one, together with several other labs simultaneously. So that was where the maddening crowd is getting a little bit too maddening.
Yeah.
And then by 92, 10 years, it took a decade to figure this whole thing out, Sugimura identified and cloned the 3rd chain of the receptor, which is called the gamma chain. And it turns out that I had visited him a year or more before that, because I took my son Kerry with me to Japan, and we toured all around.
Oh, wow.
We went over, we visited every major island, every major city, and I gave talks. And I was looking for a place for Kerry to take a year off from college and go to Japan, and Sugimura took him in.
Wow.
And that was great. So
his host family.
Yeah, well, Sugimura was just wonderful, and he one of his right-hand men was a fellow by the name of Masa Nakamura, and Nakamura took Kerry under his wing. And it turns out that they had Kerry was a college student at Connecticut College in New London, where the Thames comes down and where the Coast Guard Academy is, and where they have the nuclear submarine is there right in the port or whatever. And he was on the crew team of Connecticut College. And it turns out that Nakamura had his own crew team in Sendai. And so, so Kerry just jumped in the boat, so he did crew the whole time that he was there. So anyway, Sugimura, unbeknownst to me, was working. I decided not to get involved in the race for the 3rd chain, because it was sort of anticlimactic to be only one of 3 or 4 labs that did the 2nd chain. Mm-hmm. So I thought, I'm just not going to do the 3rd chain, let somebody else do it. And so Sugimura was the one that did it. But Kerry was there, but they kept it secret from Kerry. He was working. He was working on something else, and so it was funny.
Very cool. Okay.